sports. It's in the game.
Press the Enter key to start.
Recently, I kept seeing this person on my feed on TikTok who gave me serious doubts as to this person's credibility. This person was positioning herself as an authority on psychology, and there were a number of red flags that I got. I took a little bit of a deeper look, and it turns out this person has been accused of misrepresenting her qualifications to seem like more of an authority on psychology. But rather than making a video tearing down a person, I figured I would try to make this more constructive by talking about how we can more broadly recognize the signs of a pseudo-intellectual or a shady intellectual. Because pseudo-intellectualism is definitely on the rise. We're just seeing the beginning of it. Especially with the rise of podcasts that heavily feature certain types of intellectuals, if you start to realize that a lot of these intellectuals are shady, my concern is that they're going to assume this selection bias means all intellectuals are bad. So I think it's really important for us to be able to practice discernment, to identify between someone truly having intellectual qualifications on something and someone kind of cosplaying the aesthetic of it. If you don't know me, I'm Dr. Anna Yudin. I'm a doctor of clinical psychology and also a fiction author. And let's get started. We need to talk about pseudo-intellectuals. I feel like the crux of this issue is really just the appeal to authority fallacy, which is when a person relies on some source of authority, like a degree, a qualification, and so forth, as their argument instead of actually making an argument. For example, let's say that John goes to the doctor, and John's doctor tells him not to eat apples because they're dangerous. And when John dares to question the statement or asks what is the evidence for this, John's doctor says, "Are you seriously questioning a doctor right now?" That would be an example of an appeal to authority. Or when a person with a doctorate in, say, counselor supervision and education uses that doctorate to mislead people into thinking he's some sort of authority on, say, true crime. We live in a culture where certain types of authority are so valued to the point where they're considered a logical argument. And we put more stock in the opinions of people who are authorities on matters rather than people who don't have authority on it. And look, the truth is, there's a reason for that. When somebody has gone to school for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years for something, there's a good chance that they probably learned certain information and skills that the average layperson might not have access to in a specific field. However, just because somebody is likely to have more information than the average layperson doesn't mean they necessarily are going to have a good take. People in positions of authority or people with specialized qualifications can sometimes make mistakes, have bad takes, even make unscientific claims. On the other hand, someone with very little qualifications in a specific field can raise good points, independently learn about the field, or even just have a fresh perspective by nature of not being in the field. I think sometimes when you're in a field really deep, you can kind of lose the forest for the trees. For example, I remember years ago at a former workplace, there was a new employee, and this employee was telling me that he wanted to shake things up at the workplace. He was suggesting how people do things a little bit more efficiently. The workplace was very resistant to that and kind of had this attitude of like, no, this is how we've always done things, so this is how we're going to continue to do things. I think sometimes when you have an outsider or someone with less experience coming in, looking at things with a fresh perspective, that can have a lot of value. So a person having authority is not a logical argument as to why they're automatically right about something. Just as a person not having authority on something doesn't automatically mean they don't have a right to speak up. We need to judge whether people are right and wrong based on the content of what they're saying, not based on their background or the amount of letters behind their name. And because we've so idealized authority as a society, we also sometimes see the shadow of this effect, how sometimes people devalue authority. Some people literally think that all doctors, all therapists, and so forth are crooks. They have almost like a kind of paranoia towards people in positions of authority that, if you really look at it deep down, is born of insecurity. Let me explain. We live in a society where authority is idealized, like I was saying. So when somebody insecure brushes up against someone in one of those positions, they're automatically going to feel inferior. They're automatically going to feel bad about themselves. And in order to compensate for that and to make themselves feel better psychologically, they go ahead and just devalue all authority and employ kind of this black and white attitude of everybody in this group is bad. Everybody in this group are crooks. And I worry that the more of these pseudo-intellectuals that we see, the more people are going to shift into that kind of splitting where they think that all doctors are bad or all intellectuals are bad or all therapists or psychiatrists, whatever. Everybody in this group is bad, and mistrusting entire fields because of it. They're going to assume that a few bad apples, a few people masquerading as intellectuals, are representative of the entire field. Now, before I go into the characteristics of a pseudo-intellectual, We have to differentiate between pseudo-intellectuals and just plain old shady intellectuals. Pseudo-intellectuals are people who cosplay almost like the aesthetic of an intellectual in order to utilize the appeal to authority fallacy. They have little training or background or qualifications in the field in which they're trying to portray themselves as an expert. Or maybe they do have some qualifications, but not in the fields that they want you to think they do. And look, some of them do have insightful things to say, but the fact that they feel the need to misrepresent their qualifications signals to me that they're lying. They're willing to lie about this, they're probably willing to lie about other things too. They want to ride off the coattails of an appeal to authority fallacy, probably because they want to manipulate. What qualifications somebody has is just a fact. It's just information. It's just a way for you to know where that person's likely getting their information. True intellectuals, when they state their qualifications, it's just matter of fact. It's not used as an argument. These kinds of pseudo-intellectuals are what we get when we value the appearance of intellectualism over actual intellectual values. For example, I get a ton of comments still to this day, even though I've shown my diploma, even though I've made a video about this, of people who just straight up don't believe I have a doctorate, straight up think I'm lying. Not because of anything I've said, but just because I don't look like how they imagine a doctor of psychology to look. There, is that better? Do I look like more of a doctor now? And I don't expect any special treatment for being a doctor. When I interact with people, I ask them to please call me Anna rather than Dr. Anna. In my personal life, I never bring up the fact that I'm a doctor. Frankly, I sometimes forget that I have a doctorate. But it fucking sucks to know that when I move through the world, people not only automatically assume that I'm not a doctor, but genuinely disbelieve it when they learn that information simply because of the way I look. Contrast the way people disbelieve my qualifications with the way, for instance, they talk about Robert Greene. Now, look, I don't have any problem with Robert Greene. I don't think that he pretends to be an intellectual, and I actually find his books to be quite insightful. But simply because he has more of the appearance of an intellectual, people tend to assume that he has a lot more qualifications than he does. The other day, I heard somebody describing him as a psychologist and an expert researcher in his field. This is someone with a bachelor's in the classics, by the way, that's his background. But all because he speaks about psychology with confidence, people tend to assume that he's like a leading expert in psychology. Robert Greene is a leading researcher of psychology the same way that my three-legged cat is an expert in cat surgery. He might have some valuable insights to say on the matter, but I wouldn't necessarily trust him anywhere near a scalpel. So those are pseudo-intellectuals, people who kind of masquerade as being intellectuals. But there are also shady intellectuals that kind of factor similarly into this discussion. These are people who do have actual training or authority in the field, but chronically abuse it, whether it be to make unscientific claims, or to get very wealthy, or to pretend to be authorities in fields other than what they're actually an authority in. But at what point does somebody veer into the territory of shady intellectual? Because I think it's important for us to remember that intellectuals are not infallible. Like I said, intellectuals are human beings who sometimes make mistakes. So just because an intellectual has a bad take, that doesn't mean that they're not an intellectual. If we act like it does, then we're, again, idealizing intellectualism. I don't really know the answer to this, so I'd love to hear your input down below. At what point do you think somebody veers into chronically making so many scientific or intellectual mistakes or shortcuts that they're really not an intellectual anymore, that they're actually kind of a shady person? But let's talk about the characteristics of pseudo-intellectuals, and then we'll talk about the characteristics of shady intellectuals. How to identify a pseudo-intellectual. One way is that they're very secretive about their qualifications. You have to go digging as to what their background is, and even then, it kind of seems like they're trying to evade the matter. For example, when I first read a Joe Dispenza book, I was very interested in how somebody is writing a book that contains neuroscience, quantum mechanics, biology, medicine, all in one. I wanted to know, hold up, what is this person's background? Because it kind of seems like he's trying to portray himself as an expert in everything. And if that's the case, I'm not sure this is somebody I really trust. So I looked at the back cover. Dr. Joe Dispenza is an international lecturer, researcher, corporate consultant, author, and educator who has been invited to speak in more than 33 countries on 5 continents. Okay, still doesn't tell me what his doctorate is in. Still doesn't tell me what his background is. At that point, I started to get a little suspicious. So I googled him, I looked him up on Wikipedia, and you know what? At the time when I did, there was, interestingly again, no information about his qualifications. Side note, I actually went to go look at his Wikipedia page again, and I couldn't find one. I don't know if I'm misremembering whether I was looking at Wikipedia, maybe I was looking at his website instead. Either, yes, I was just looking at his website, or somebody took down his Wikipedia page. And then I got a little bit more suspicious, and I said, it certainly seems like somebody may have scrubbed the internet of what this person's qualifications actually are. Allegedly, that's what it seems like to me. There was only one article that I managed to find that told me that Dr. Joe Dispenza is a chiropractor, and he got his chiropractor degree from a school that had its accreditation revoked 3 years after he graduated. Not a neuroscientist, not an epigeneticist, not a doctor of medicine, not a biologist, not a physicist. That is a really simple way of figuring out if somebody is not actually an intellectual, if they are intentionally being vague about what their qualifications are. Because the more vague a person is about their qualifications, the more they're trying to mislead you about how far their qualifications go. Typically, when somebody has a certain degree or a certain licensure, they make it very clear. You do not have to go very hard trying to find it. Within 1 to 2 clicks, you can usually figure out exactly what their background is. Another way that you can spot a pseudo-intellectual is these tiny little subtle ways of cosplaying the appearance of an intellectual. For example, a huge one is you'll notice there are certain accounts of people who have TikToks, for instance, of them talking to what seems to be a podcast, or talking to someone who seems to be asking them questions as if they're an authority in the field. But when you really take a closer look, you realize this was never a real podcast. This person is just hiring somebody to ask them questions for the camera so that they can then seem like more of an authority when they actually upload that video. Another pet peeve of mine is when people call something a masterclass, but they are not an established master in that field. Why do you think I named it the Connection course and not Masterclass and Connection? Because I'm just a doctor of psychology. I'm not a renowned expert in the field. I was having this conversation with my husband, and he was saying, like, yeah, I feel like in order to call something a masterclass, somebody else needs to come to you and say, hey, I perceive you as a master. Like how Esther Perel had a masterclass with actual masterclass. You don't get to be the one to decide, I'm a master in this. And there are way too many people out there who perceive themselves to be masters in a field where nobody knows about them. Another one that really annoys me is you'll see these TikToks often, usually real doctors. Again, they'll have somebody with a camera coming up to them and asking them, hey doc, what do you think about XYZ, or what do you recommend for ABC? And it's like, bro, like, we know that you just hired like your husband or your wife or whoever to come up to you and ask this question. You're trying to portray yourself as like being accosted by paparazzi so that you can give this insightful seeming answer.
Hey Dr. Anna, I'm so glad I found you. What fiction books do you recommend for this fall?
Oh man, that's a hard one. I'd have to say I recommend The Person That Reigns by Dr. Anna Uden. It's a really wonderful book for exploring intergenerational trauma, witchcraft, female empowerment. Yeah, check it out, link below.
Thank you.
It's so manipulative. Another variation of this is when people start a video by saying, today's question asks me to analyze XYZ, that nobody asked them to analyze that. The news broke half an hour ago. How did you even make this video so quickly? Did you just look on Wikipedia? Also, pseudo-intellectuals take part in behavior that's at odds with what intellectuals are taught to do, whether it be being unprofessional, being unethical, being unscientific. All of these are things that you're kind of taught when you do higher education or when you do grad school or get extended degrees that you're not supposed to do because they're not good ways of preserving the integrity of truth. For example, calling somebody a tramp who can't afford your coaching services would be unprofessional behavior, and I seriously doubt that person would ever last in a grad school program. A person with proper qualifications would know not to do something like that. Also, pseudo-intellectuals tend to copy the work of others without giving credit. Intellectuals typically cite their sources because it's drilled into us, and also because we love to hype up our role models. It's not about grandiosity for us. Well, some of us. Now, of course, when we're talking about general information, like something that somebody has learned over the course of, say, 7 years in grad school, I think that's different. I think you can sometimes speak from your experience as somebody who's trained in that field without citing every single source. What I'm talking about here is people who basically plagiarize, who take other people's ideas as their own. For example, A few months ago, I made a video about a technique that I learned about from Martin Seligman's book Flourish. Later that day, that same day, a TikToker posted a video discussing that technique with no reference to Martin Seligman or my video that he apparently learned this from. Because yes, he did admit to learning about this technique that day from my video. But pseudo-intellectuals don't want you to know where they're getting their information, because if you did, you would realize that the source of their knowledge is one YouTube video. But occasionally pseudo-intellectuals slip up and they reveal how little they know about the topic at hand. If you can pay attention to those moments, it's very important. This is hard because you do have to be somewhat of an expert in that field to know when a confident person is just talking out of their ass, but sometimes you might catch a whiff that somebody is just not quite as much of an expert in something as they think they are. For example, people who talk about quantum leaping. I don't think you have to be a quantum physicist to know that the way a lot of people talk about quantum leaping is completely unscientific and complete bogus. I'm sure actual quantum mechanics would like to quantum leap out of the dimension in which people make statements like this. Or just the other day, somebody was talking about how they studied psychology in school. They were referring to a bachelor's, and this is not even their major. They were talking about how they studied psychology in school to show that there's some sort of authority on the field. And this person wasn't even sure what Pavlovian classical conditioning was called. Something that you literally learn within the first 5 minutes of Psych 101. Pseudo-intellectuals also speak in absolutes rather than nuance. I love the Albert Einstein quote, "The more I learn, the more I realize how much I don't know." I think it's true. I think that the more a person learns about a field or just the world in general, the more they realize that it's important to be humble. Even when I first started this channel, when I was still in grad school, I spoke in a lot more absolutes and extreme language than I do now. And that's because over the course of experience and gaining wisdom, you realize things are not that black and white. So when someone has a very extreme take, that's usually a pretty good sign that they're not very well versed in what they're talking about. Now, a lot of pseudo-intellectuals in this day and age also offer unregulated coaching. Now look, there are actual coaching certifications you can get. And there are some situations where maybe it doesn't make sense to get certified for coaching. Like if you're an experienced author coaching a younger author, you don't need a certification for that. But if somebody made absolutely no attempt to get certified in this field, and or the area in which they're trying to seem like an authority to coach people on is actually a regulated field that they're not participating in, they're probably a scammer. Why would somebody take a 2-week nutrition course instead of becoming a registered dietitian? Why would somebody become a marriage coach instead of going to school to be an MFT? You have to ask yourself why this person cut corners. Most times it comes down to money. It comes down to the fact that they don't actually care about this field. They're not trying to invest in it. They're not actually trying to learn about it. They just want a quick buck. And look, actual therapists sometimes do also provide coaching. Because of jurisdiction regulations, basically therapists can't practice outside of their state or their country. So sometimes it's easier for them to say, well, I provide therapy in this place and I also provide coaching worldwide. I don't judge them as harshly for that because I understand that jurisdiction regulations can be very limiting and they actually did get the degree. They do have the qualifications to do what they're doing. But let's be for real. A lot of people that do this are doing it for a quick buck because they want to expand their practice to offer services worldwide, regardless of jurisdiction. I'm just saying, let's be for real. What about the characteristics of shady intellectuals? Shady intellectuals also mislead people into thinking their qualifications are more general than they are. Typically, they don't lie about their qualifications, they'll make it upfront what their degree is, but they just kind of push the boundaries of what they want people to see them as an authority on. For example, let's say a clinical psychologist wants you to think that he's an expert on climate change. Just saying. Shady intellectuals also will often try to sell you a groundbreaking cure that somehow the rest of the field has no idea about. They've spent their entire career researching something that later turns out to be a conflict of interest, something that they make a lot of money from. If a person's research is funding support for their own product, that should raise some red flags. For example, a few months ago when I had a chat with Beamng on my channel, I referenced something vaguely. I didn't mention who it was about. I had just read the book Lifespan by David Sinclair, and I had some unanswered questions about his research. Some of the statements he made about longevity seemed a little bit out of place to me compared to what others in his field say, and after looking into it a little more closely, I realized that he had some conflict of interest based on his research which was not able to be replicated. Just today, I was looking him up to check up on what happened, and I discovered that right around that time, Harvard professor David Sinclair was forced to resign the presidency of the Academy of Health and Lifespan Research after accusations of scientific dishonesty and conflict of interests. But where do we draw the line? Because, look, for example, John Gottman monetizes his resources at the Gottman Institute. He has courses, books, content creation. And he's researched relationships his whole life. I don't think that makes him a shady intellectual. In my opinion, it becomes a red flag when somebody is cutting corners in their research. And we know this because their research is not able to be replicated, or their claims are inconsistent with what the broader field considers to be true at that point in time. Like, say, a doctor who claims that there are no adverse effects of UV exposure. That would be something that's like, well, the entire field of medicine disagrees with you on this, so you're gonna need to explain what you mean by that. Or this magical cure that they're trying to sell you is completely inaccessible to the people who need it most. They're charging people thousands of dollars for a magical cure. Pretty clear they're just trying to line their own pocket, right? And also I find that shady intellectuals often try to pander to a specific audience or ideology. They've realized what their specific audience likes to hear, and they distort their research into supporting a conclusion that their audience will like. Shady intellectuals also love to hide behind the mask of neutrality or objectivity while espousing opinions that consistently reveal their ideology. Look, I'm not saying that you have to be a moderate in order to be an intellectual, not at all. But please don't try to frame yourself as some beacon of objectivity and neutrality when you experience the same exact biases and prejudices as everyone. I'm sorry, but you're not actually a moderate when a majority of your viewpoints align with one side of the political spectrum, and your criticism of ideologues only extends to the ideologues who disagree with you. When someone is doing that, when an intellectual tries to frame themselves as neutral, but really they're pandering to a specific audience, that's shady to me. I'm sure I'm missing something, some sort of characteristic of pseudo-intellectuals or shady intellectuals. If you think I did miss any, pop them down below. The point I really want to drive home is this. Someone being an authority in a specific field does not automatically make them right. Listen to the content of what people are saying. Pay attention to the signs that somebody is trying to portray themselves as a bigger authority than they really are in order to manipulate or deceive. Don't believe somebody just because they act like they're an authority in a specific field, and truly just try to pay attention to the quality of the arguments that they're making. Like I said, you guys, I have a feeling about this. Pseudo-intellectuals are only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, because we've seen a huge boom in the past few years of these very intellectual podcasts where a lot of intellectuals get invited over to present a certain worldview. And in some cases that's great. Some of them are lovely and they feature a lot of people that have valuable insights. The problem is the ones that feature a lot of people who are shady, who are pretending to be intellectuals. Because what I fear that's going to do is it's going to give lay people the impression that all intellectuals are like this, all intellectuals are shady. And then people are going to start mistrusting authorities in the field. They're going to devalue anyone that has higher education in a specific field. And then the very people who are the most trained to discuss these issues are going to be considered untrustworthy. And what do you think that's going to do to misinformation and to the ability to get at the bottom of what the truth is? Hope that this video is helpful. I really want to hear your thoughts down below. And there's actually one more thing that I'd love your opinion on. Thank you if you've watched this far. Something that I've been really ambivalent about is whether or not to call out individuals' behavior in my videos. Because gossip channels, tea channels, these people that encourage everyone to be better, do better, tear people down, they really get on my nerves. They really, really do. They're dripping with condescension and moral self-righteousness. So the last thing I want to do is to become like what I hate. And at the same time, I sometimes channels, tea channels, those behavior thing that I'd love your. If this video is helpful, I really want to hear your thoughts down below. And there's actually one more thing that I'd love your opinion on. Thank you if you've watched this far. Something that I've been really ambivalent about is whether or not to call out individuals' behavior in my videos. Because gossip channels, tea channels, these people that encourage everyone to be better, do better, tear people down, they really get on my nerves. They really, really do. They're dripping with condescension and moral self-righteousness. So the last thing I want to do is to become like what I hate. And at the same time, I sometimes feel it's important to call out specific individuals' behavior as misinformation or as harmful or whatever. So I'm just kind of at an impasse here. I'm just not sure whether I want to name people or talk about the broader issue. And I would love to hear your opinions in the comments because I I know that you guys often have insightful things to say in response to my videos. So please make your arguments in the comments. Do you think that I should talk about specific individuals' behaviors, or do you think that I should keep it vague and just stick to the topic? Thank you so much. Take care.
our video. Life hurts. We all feel it. Breakups, illness, loss, loneliness, even death. And here's Buddha saying, "Hey, guess what? Life is suffering." Thanks, Buddha. Real uplifting message there, but wait. If that's true, what's the point of all this? Why even try? Why get out of bed in the morning? If we're trapped in an endless cycle of rebirth and suffering, what's the purpose of existence? That's the question that kept me awake at 3 a.m., and I'm betting it's crossed your mind too. Hey everyone, Matt here from Buddha's Wisdom. Some of you might remember our video about the meaning of life, where we explored the big picture of meaning through Buddhism's lens. But today, we're going deeper. Today is different. Today I want to explore this question honestly, because I struggled with it for years. When I finally understood what Buddha was really saying about life's meaning, it wasn't what I expected, but it changed how I see everything. The meaning of life according to Buddhism isn't some secret formula or distant goal. It's something both simpler and more eye-opening than most of us realize. And I think you'll be surprised by what it reveals about your own life. Let's start with a question. When was the last time you thought, I'll be happy when I get that promotion, when I find the right relationship, when I finally lose those 15 pounds, when I have enough money? I used to do this all the time. One day I caught myself thinking, I'll be happy when I understand Buddhism better. And then I realized the irony. I was using Buddha's teachings as another happiness trap. Here's what most people get wrong about Buddha's first noble truth. When he said life is suffering, he wasn't being a downer. The Pali word dukkha doesn't just mean suffering, it means unsatisfactoriness. That feeling that something's always a little off. Remember last month when you finally got that thing you wanted so badly? That iPhone with the killer camera. That date with the person whose Instagram you've been stalking. That job offer with the fancy title. How long did that happiness last before you started wanting something else? 3 days? A week? Until the next iOS update or LinkedIn notification? Exactly. I had this brutal realization a few years ago after a breakup. I was devastated, lying on my apartment floor at night, crying into a cold pepperoni pizza, scrolling through our vacation photos, wondering how I'd ever feel okay again. Classic rock bottom, right? But in that moment, something clicked. I realized I'd been treating happiness like some destination I'd eventually reach if I just checked enough boxes on life's scavenger hunt. Buddha saw this trap 2,500 years ago. We're wired to want things, get them, and then immediately want more. It's like we're hamsters on a wheel, running and running, but never getting anywhere. The happiness trap keeps us stuck in this cycle, always chasing but never arriving. So if life is just an endless series of desires that never fully satisfy us, what's the point? Why keep running on the wheel? That's where many people walk away from Buddhist teachings. They think, well, if everything leads to suffering, then nothing matters. But that's where they're wrong, and where things get really interesting. The happiness trap isn't just about chasing pleasure. It's about misunderstanding what makes life meaningful in the first place. And the path out of this trap leads us to another bizarre paradox of Buddhism that most people completely miss. Have you ever played a video game that's impossible to win? That's what seeking enlightenment can feel like sometimes. When I first got into Buddhism, I had this image in my head. Me sitting cross-legged on a mountain, perfectly serene. Problems just bouncing off my enlightened force field. I'd finally made it. But after years of practice and study, I realized something uncomfortable. I was playing an impossible game. Let me explain. In our video 8 Steps to Nirvana to Reach Peace, we talked about the Noble Eightfold Path, Buddha's roadmap to enlightenment. But there's something I didn't fully explain then. These 8 steps, they're not like a checklist you complete once, and then you're done. They're not even like stairs you climb to reach the top. They're more like Instruments in an orchestra you need to keep playing, simultaneously, forever. I remember the day this hit me. I was at a silent meditation retreat feeling pretty good about my practice. 3 whole days without checking Twitter. Practically a bodhisattva, right? Then I lost my phone. Within seconds, I went from spiritual practitioner to frantic guy turning over every cushion in the meditation hall and accusing the monk in the corner of theft. My Zen face replaced by panic sweating. So much for my progress, right? My teacher just laughed when I confessed how upset I'd gotten. He said, "Did you think enlightenment meant never feeling frustrated again?" That's not freedom. That's emotional numbness. He shared a quote from Zen master Shunryu Suzuki. The most important point is to accept yourself and stand on your 2 feet. Not the enlightened self, not the perfect self, just yourself, right now. This was a total game changer for me. I'd been striving for this perfect end state, this graduation day when I'd finally get it and be done. But that's not how it works. The Buddha himself said, "The way is not in the sky, the way is in the heart." He wasn't talking about some distant destination. He was talking about how we meet this moment, right here. So if enlightenment isn't a finish line, if nirvana isn't some trophy we eventually earn, what's the point of all this effort? Why meditate? Why practice? Why try to live ethically if we're never done? The answer completely changed my understanding of what Buddhism is actually about.
Start, slight right, slight left. Good luck.
So if we can't escape suffering completely, and enlightenment isn't some medal we earn, what exactly is the point? This was the question that kept me up at night, and the answer I found changed everything. Buddhism has a secret weapon that transforms how we experience suffering. It's not meditation, though that helps. It's not detachment, though that's part of it. It's something much simpler and more powerful. Compassion. I used to think compassion was just being nice to people. Hold doors open, donate to charity, basic good person stuff. But Buddhist compassion, what they call karuna, goes way deeper. Let me get personal for a minute. Last year, my mom got sick, really sick. I moved back home to help care for her. Feeding her soup she could barely swallow, helping her to the bathroom at 3 a.m., watching her hands tremble as she tried to hold a glass of water. The antiseptic smell of the house, the constant beeping of medication reminders, the hushed phone calls with doctors. It was brutal. There was so much suffering, hers and mine. One night, exhausted and feeling sorry for myself, I remembered something from the Dalai Lama. If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. It sounded nice, but honestly, in that moment it felt like some greeting card nonsense. How would compassion help either of us? But I tried something. Instead of seeing my mom's situation as this horrible thing happening to both of us, I started seeing it as an opportunity to express love. The same tasks, helping her eat, helping her walk, but with a different intention. Everything looked different. The suffering didn't disappear. My back still ached from lifting her. I still woke up exhausted. She still had bad days, but it had meaning now. It wasn't pointless pain. It was love made visible. Those moments holding her hand while she slept weren't just duties to endure. They became the most important meditation I'd ever practiced. Buddha understood something fundamental about human psychology. When we focus only on our own happiness, life can feel empty and pointless. But when we connect with others, when we make alleviating suffering our purpose, meaning appears naturally. Buddha taught that our purpose emerges naturally when we align our actions with compassion and mindfulness. For many of us, this purpose reveals itself through connecting with others and alleviating suffering where we can. But here's where we often go wrong, especially in the West. We try to find meaning in the wrong places. In the West, we're obsessed with finding our purpose or life calling. It's like we're all waiting for this lightning bolt moment where suddenly everything makes sense. Follow your passion, find your purpose, discover your why. I spent years jumping from job to job, relationship to relationship, even spiritual practice to spiritual practice, always searching for that perfect fit, that thing that would finally make me say, this is it. This is what I was put on earth to do. Ring any bells? Here's the problem. Buddha would say we've got it backwards. The Dhammapada teaches us about the importance of putting our full attention and effort into our actions. But the key insight isn't finding the perfect work. It's giving your heart to whatever is in front of you. I learned this lesson in the most unexpected place, washing dishes. During a 10-day silent retreat, I was assigned to dish duty. 10 days of scrubbing other people's crusty plates in silence. Not exactly my idea of spiritual growth. By day 3, I was miserable. This is not why I came here, I thought. I should be meditating, gaining insights, having breakthroughs, not washing dishes. On day 4, something weird happened. I fully gave up. I surrendered to the fact that for the next 6 days, I was just the dish guy. My spiritual resume would read, enlightenment seeker and part-time dishwasher. And in that surrender, the world tilted on its axis. I started really washing those dishes, feeling the warm water against my skin, noticing the rainbow patterns swirling in soap bubbles, hearing the soft clink of plates being stacked, feeling gratitude for the calloused hands that chopped and stirred and cooked the food, wishing well to the people who'd eaten from these plates, even the guy who somehow managed to get peanut butter on both sides. It wasn't a lightning bolt moment. It was quieter than that. But suddenly, washing dishes had meaning. Not because the task itself was important, but because I was fully present for it. The Buddha never said find your purpose. He said be fully present for your life as it unfolds. The Western obsession with finding that one perfect purpose keeps us always looking toward the future, missing the meaning that's available right now. This completely contradicts how most of us think about meaning and purpose. We think meaning comes from doing extraordinary things, starting a billion-dollar company, getting 1 million followers, having our face on a billboard. But what if the most meaningful life comes from bringing extraordinary presence to ordinary things? What if your morning commute, that boring team meeting, or folding laundry could be just as meaningful as summiting Everest? This leads us to the most counterintuitive truth of all. What if I told you the most meaningful life might come from stopping the search for meaning entirely? Stay with me here. This is where things get weird and profound. Remember those moments when you were so absorbed in something, maybe playing music, or hiking in nature, or deep in conversation with a friend, that you completely forgot yourself? Time disappeared. Your problems vanished and you were just there? Those moments of flow, of complete presence, that's what Buddhism is pointing toward. Not some grand purpose that makes your life significant in the cosmic scheme, but the simple miracle of being fully alive in this moment. Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh said, "The miracle is not to walk on water. The miracle is to walk on the green earth, dwelling deeply in the present moment and feeling truly alive." I had this experience last summer on a camping trip. I was sitting by the lake at sunset, just watching the colors change on the water. Nothing special. But suddenly, I wasn't watching the sunset. I was the sunset. The boundary between me and the world just dissolved. For those few minutes, there was no Matt trying to figure out the point of his life. There was just life happening. And it was enough. Buddhist teacher Jack Kornfield reminds us, the trouble is you think you have time. We're constantly postponing our lives, waiting for meaning to arrive, waiting to figure it all out. But life is happening now, while we're making other plans. When we stop demanding that life have some grand purpose, something paradoxical happens. We find ourselves naturally drawn to what matters. We stop asking, what's the point? And start asking, what's needed here? How can I help? What wants to come through me? The Japanese concept of ikigai, your reason for being, isn't something you discover once and for all. It's something you practice daily, through the way you engage with your ordinary life. This isn't giving up. It's not nihilism. It's actually the most engaged way to live. When we stop treating life like a problem to solve or a test to pass, we can finally show up for it fully. And that brings us to the ultimate plot twist in Buddha's teachings. So what is the meaning of life according to Buddha? Ready for the plot twist? There isn't one fixed meaning, and that's actually the good news. In our video, Buddha's Emptiness Explained, we talked about how nothing has inherent fixed meaning. And while that might sound depressing at first, it's actually incredibly liberating. Life doesn't come with meaning pre-installed. We create meaning through how we live, through our choices, our connections, our presence. Here's the radical truth Buddha was pointing to. Life isn't meaningful because of what we achieve or accumulate. It's meaningful because we're here to experience it, to taste it, to feel it, to connect through it. The meaning isn't in reaching nirvana someday. The meaning is in how you walk the path today. I remember asking my teacher, but what's the point if we're all just going to die anyway? She laughed and said, Matt, do you only eat pizza if it lasts forever? Do you refuse to watch Netflix because the series will eventually end? Do you avoid falling in love because all relationships change? Your question is like deleting Spotify because songs have endings. The point is, the experience itself, the taste, the sound, the feeling. The point is being fully here for whatever is happening, even if it's just washing those dishes we talked about earlier. Buddhism isn't about escaping life. It's about showing up for it completely. Pain, joy, boredom, excitement, all of it. It's about bringing your full attention to whatever is happening right now. The Four Noble Truths aren't a pessimistic declaration that life is suffering. They're a realistic acknowledgement that life contains suffering, and a practical path to transforming our relationship with that suffering. The meaning of life isn't something to figure out intellectually. It's something to embody through how we live. So if you're still wondering what the point of life is, maybe try asking a different question. Instead of, what's the point? Ask, what's possible right now? How can I be fully here for this one precious moment that will never come again? Because that's what Buddha was really pointing to, not some distant enlightenment, but the immediate freedom available when we stop chasing, stop resisting, and simply show up for our lives as they are. That's the ultimate meaning. Not something we find, but something we create, moment by moment, through the quality of our attention and the openness of our hearts. For me, that means spending less time doom scrolling and more time actually looking into the eyes of people I'm talking to. It means tasting my food instead of inhaling it while watching YouTube. It means feeling the sun on my skin and remembering that someday, this ordinary Tuesday might be the day I look back on and think, that was life. That was it. Picture yourself years from now looking back at this moment, not at your achievements or possessions, but at how fully you lived each ordinary day. The mornings you noticed the steam rising from your coffee cup. The times you really listened to a friend instead of planning what to say next. The walks where you felt your feet touching the earth. That's the real miracle. Not escaping life, but being fully here for it. If this perspective resonates with you, hit that subscribe button to continue exploring Buddha's wisdom with us. Drop a comment sharing how you find meaning in your daily life. And remember, the point of life isn't to avoid suffering. It's to be fully alive in each moment, whatever that moment brings. Until next time, this is Matt from Buddha's Wisdom, wishing you a life of meaning. Not because it's significant in some cosmic way, but because you're fully present for it. Imagine waking up tomorrow and you don't exist anymore. Not your body, that's still there. Not your awareness, you're still conscious, but the you that you think you are, completely gone. Your personality, your life story, your insecurities, your grudges, all vanished. What would be left? According to Buddha, this isn't just some philosophical thought experiment. It's the doorway to the greatest freedom you'll ever experience. What's up, wisdom seekers? Matt here. Today we're diving into Buddhism's most mind-bending teaching, one that flips everything you think you know about yourself upside down. We've touched on non-self in previous videos, but today we're going
Starts. Very good to be here. As you can see from my title, I'm going to be approaching the question of the role that the idea of God has to play in explaining the universe we see from the point of view of a scientist, a physicist, or a cosmologist, not the point of view of a professional theologian or philosopher. I do think that the point of view of a physicist or a scientist is relevant to this question. It's not the only possible point of view one can have. There are aspects of the idea of God that do not reduce to the roles played by a simple scientific theory. But there are also aspects of the idea of God that do play the roles of a scientific theory, and those aspects can be judged by the same criteria that we use to judge theories. In the original schedule, if you have seen that, it removed the word good from my title. So it just said God is not a theory, but that is the opposite of what I'm trying to say here. So just so you know my point of view, I'm saying that God is a theory. The idea of God, to the extent that almost all believers use the idea of God, does have aspects of it that can be judged in precisely analogous ways to the way that we judge an ordinary scientific theory. Now, I'm very well aware there is a thread of thought that says the opposite of that. It says that the idea of God is something separate, it's a different kind of idea than the ideas that we use when we have physics theories. So, you know, God is not reproducible or something like that. So I just want to get around that particular definitional problem by putting forward the idea of theory as something very, very broad. I don't want to pick some very, very specific philosophy of science definition of a theory. To me, a theory is just an idea about the universe that may be true or false. And then we should try to figure out how to judge whether or not this particular idea is true or false. One of the problems with God as a theory is that it is not a very precisely specified theory. That is going to be one of my points, is that even though we sometimes try to have God play the role of a physical theory, making predictions and explaining things, preserving some explanatory role, I'm going to argue that it doesn't do a very good job. Now, again, I will, even though I'm not a trained theologian, I certainly know that we have different conceptions of God. In fact, this is what I would argue is one of the check marks against God as a very good theory, is that if you try to say, well, here's why I don't believe in God, someone else will say, you just don't understand what God is. God is completely different than that. And I recognize that I will try to at least explain which versions of God I am talking about. I can't guarantee they're your favorite versions. So we can pick out three. It's not an exclusive list. Passive, active, and emergent conceptions of God. And what I mean by this under passive is the kind of roles that are given to God going back to some of the ancient Greeks, going back at least to Aristotle, a sort of philosophical role for God as something that helps explain, helps sustain the universe. An unmoved mover, a first cause, a necessary being, various philosophical notions that are not necessarily empirical in the same way that scientific theories are. This kind of God is one that just is something that we need in this conception to make sense of the universe, not something that necessarily is going around poking around in the universe and intervening it and changing the physical laws. The active conception of God is a more personal idea. Often people will define God as a kind of person, just as often they will say that God is not a person, but there's this conception of God as someone who cares about life here on earth, cares about human beings, cares both in the sense that, he wants us to succeed, but also sometimes he judges us, and sometimes a little harshly. It depends on how far you want to go, but God will pass down moral guidance. will set up an afterlife for you, that you'll be sorted once you die and so forth. There's various uses that this sort of more active God has to perform. And finally, there's what I like to call an emergent idea of God, which is to say that God not as a fundamental category, but God as a way of talking about aspects of the universe that you could also choose to talk about in different ways. God is the laws of nature. God is the orderliness of the cosmos. God is the universe itself, or God is love, or God is our feeling of awe and transcendence as we approach the universe. And these different conceptions of God have different justifications for them. The passive notion of God just in the background can be attempted to be justified on purely logical grounds, just by thinking about how the universe might be. The more active conception of God is going to be essentially an empirical argument, that the best way to explain the universe we see is to imagine that God is doing these things in an active sense. Whereas the emergent idea of God is a more rhetorical move, and I don't mean that in any disparaging way. It's a way of talking about the universe that we see. So I'm actually not going to be talking about this third category. My personal belief, for those of you who are fascinated by it, is that I don't see any need to talk about the universe in that vocabulary. But if you want to, I won't stop you. What I'm more interested in for the purposes of this talk are the conceptions of God that introduce God as a separate metaphysical category that we have something to do with. And I'll start with these more philosophical, metaphysical arguments in favor of God. I think that as a scientist, the second category is more relevant, but I do have to get this one out of the way before we can move on to the second one. So, what does it mean, and what is the role played by God as an unmoved mover, as an Aristotelian first cause, God as a necessary being? Very often, if you ask theologians, how would the universe be different if God did not exist? They will say, I cannot imagine a universe in which God does not exist, therefore I cannot answer that question. To me, as a scientist, there's a huge problem right from the start with this kind of reasoning, which is that the whole strategy is one based on some a priori metaphysics. That is to say, this is very much armchair philosophizing in the best sense of the word, sitting down, thinking about all the possible ways the world can be, and concluding that those ways must somehow involve the idea of God. There's no step in that process in which you actually go out and look at how the universe actually is. You don't need to in this way of thinking about it, because you can just argue logically that God must be part of the universe. It is my firm belief this kind of reasoning has never taught us anything true and interesting about the actual world. That is not to say that armchair thinking without going out and looking at the world is not useful in any way. It's extremely useful. Mathematics, logic, other branches of philosophy and formal inquiry are not empirical in nature. They don't involve going out and looking at the actual world. They reason in an a priori sense, but they also don't reveal interesting truths about the actual world. Mathematics reveals consequences of axioms. You say, I have a certain axiomatic structure and I derive theorems on the basis of that. It doesn't tell you which axioms are possibly true. If you want to actually figure out our universe, does it involve some notion of God, that is an actual fact about the specific universe in which we live. And I personally don't think this a priori kind of reasoning is ever going to get us there. But let me take it seriously for just a little bit and sort of give you my feelings as a scientist about this. How would we refute the claim that God is a necessary being, for example? And I should also admit that I'm happily conflating all sorts of ultimately different kinds of a priori metaphysical arguments. First cause, prime mover, necessary being. These are all subtly different in ways that I'm going to completely ignore, so sorry about that. They have a similar flavor and I'm going to treat them similarly. So if you did believe that God was a necessary being, that you literally could not imagine a universe in which God did not play an important role, in order, logically, for me to refute that belief, all I need to do is to invent a universe in which God does not exist. If you say that all swans are white, as a logical fact, all I need to do is show you one black swan to show that your logical argument can't be right. So all we need to do is invent a universe that God does not play a role in, and that would improve your imagination enough so that you could imagine universes where God was not important. I claim that it is not hard to invent universes, possible universes, hypothetical universes, not necessarily our own, but universes that are self-contained, consistent, coherent, and in which God plays no special role, no role at all. So here's a universe. Apologies for the math. This universe is three-dimensional space, evolving in time, and in that space there is one particle. That is the whole universe. This particle moves according to Newton's laws of motion under the influence of some potential energy. So here's space, there's time, there's our particle moving, it has an equation of motion. And this goes on forever into the infinite far past or the infinite far future. I claim this is a logically conceivable universe, that you can't stop me from imagining that this is the universe. It's clearly not our universe. I'm not trying to claim that there is some complicated transformation that makes our real world look like this. But this could be a universe. And there's no God in this universe. There's just a particle moving. If you want a slightly more realistic example, here is a universe that I think might actually be right. I replace, instead of three-dimensional space, I have a space of states, which is some Hilbert space, that is to say, some quantum mechanical space of possible states, a space of wave functions, if you like. There's also time evolution, so the state is an element of that Hilbert space, and it evolves with time. If you want to know how it evolves, well, it solves this equation, Schrodinger's equation, where this capital H is an operator called the Hamiltonian, which basically tells you how the state evolves with time. So this universe is one that is mathematically isomorphic to a trajectory in a Hilbert space according to this Schrodinger's equation. It goes forever, from the infinite far past to the infinite far future. It is self-contained. There's no something outside this universe that is holding it up, sustaining it, keeping it going, causing it to exist, or allowing it to persist. It is simply that mathematical structure, full stop. I actually, like I said, think that this is a plausible mathematical structure for the real world in which we live. Clearly, there are some details to be filled in. I need to know what the actual Hamiltonian of the world is, which I don't claim to know. But this is a plausible framework for reality. Just to give you a final idea of what kinds of universes I'm thinking about, here is a world, a universe. It's one point. This is actually bigger than a point because it's hard to show you a point. So this is a circle. But imagine a mathematical structure that is isomorphic to a single point. I claim that is a possible universe. Once again, it is not our universe in any interesting way, but it is a conceivable universe. And once again, God plays no role. So what am I trying to get at here? What I'm trying to get at is that if you sat down again, a priori, and tried to think about all the possible ways that existence could manifest itself, we know that to at least some extent, there are mathematical ways of talking about existence, talking about the real world. I can easily imagine self-contained and consistent mathematical structures in which the notion of God or necessary beings or first causes play no role whatsoever. Now, this is not some brilliant new insight. People who do believe in necessary beings and so forth have a response to this. They will say, sure, you can imagine that, but they're not really legitimate possibilities for what the world can be like. And that's because there's no explanation, fundamentally. There's no reason why the world is like that. The role of God is to ground why this world rather than some other, or indeed, why this world at all, why a world at all. So the response to my examples would be, sure, you can mathematically write those down, but you haven't explained why that would be the universe. And my response to those arguments is, so what? Who is to say that I'm supposed to explain why there is a universe? You might prefer that there be an explanation as to why this universe rather than that universe, but you can't prove logically that there must be some explanation. The universe could just be. That is the fundamental disagreement between people who believe in a metaphysical notion of God and the more empirically minded scientists. So let me flesh that out just a little bit. just because we have a universe isn't necessarily true that there is some explanation or reason or cause. I think that the reason why you'd be tempted to think that is because in our actual universe, you associate causes with events. Things happen, you go, I can explain to you why that happened. Here is the reason why. Now, there's two things to notice about that. One is that there are very often multiple different sounding reasons that you could give for a single event. Why did this football team lose their match? Well, because the goalie let in that goal, or well, because they were ill-prepared, or well, because space-time is four-dimensional. I mean, there's many possible reasons you could give. What counts as a reason depends on the framework in which you are speaking. Reasons are not existing once and for all uniquely all by themselves. They appear within context. And the context in which the whole universe appears is different, whatever it might be, than all the contexts in which things inside the universe appear. Even if it were true, and I don't think that it is true, but even if it were true, that everything inside the universe can be associated with a reason or a cause, that doesn't mean that the same thing applies to the universe itself. It may or may not. And so the second point is that you might want to invent a principle. You might want to invent a way of thinking, the principle of sufficient reason or something like that, that simply demands that things have explanations, that nothing that occurs does so without a reason why. But my response to that would be, why? Why is it necessary that everything have a reason why? And you could give an argument. You say, well, when I look at the universe, everything that happens has a reason why. But the point is that you're now taking your metaphysical argument and turning it into an empirical one. Why is it necessary for things to have reasons or explanations? Well, I see that things have reasons or explanations, but that doesn't mean that you can simply draw the conclusion that everything that happens must happen for a reason. The example that I like to use is conservation of energy, because conservation of energy is something, well, you look around, you see a lot of different things happening, a lot of different processes, dynamical happenings in the world, and you go, look, every single time I can associate a number, the energy, which is constant over time. It doesn't change in the process of this dynamical event. So I invent a law of nature, conservation of energy. But the point is, the logic is not, I see that energy is conserved, therefore energy is conserved. The logic is, I see that energy is conserved, therefore I make a hypothesis. I imagine that energy is actually conserved, and then I go out and test that hypothesis. It's an empirical one. I look for a logical foundation in the basis of some wider theory, and I actually do tests. There are experimental tests of energy conservation. It might be wrong. Likewise, if you see that everything in the universe happens for a reason, which I don't think is actually true, but even if you saw that, you would at best be able to say, therefore, I hypothesize that perhaps everything happens for a reason. Perhaps, therefore, the universe has a cause or a reason, but that's not simply a metaphysical demand, that is an idea that you should go out and test. So it goes back to being an empirical claim and should be evaluated accordingly. As just one more example, there's something called the Kalam cosmological argument that begins by saying that everything that has a beginning has a cause. And therefore, it says the universe has a beginning. It then says the universe has a beginning, therefore the universe must be caused. But the response to this is, maybe not. I don't even need to say, no, it's not true that everything that has a beginning has a cause. All I need to be able to say is, maybe there are things that happen without causes. It then becomes an empirical claim that I need to go out and judge, just like I judge every other scientific theory, just like conservation of energy. So the conclusion of this kind of reasoning is that we should think about God as an empirically testable hypothesis, not as something that is completely a priori. Even the purported metaphysical arguments that God is necessary ultimately come down to contingent empirical claims. So what we should actually be asking is, does including God in our ontology, does having God play a role in our conception of how the world works, give us the best possible theory on conventional scientific grounds? Now, admittedly, we don't understand what those conventional scientific grounds are with perfect clarity. The idea of what is the best possible explanation for something, even within science, is a bone of contention. But I'm not going to get into that in any detail. I think we all sort of know it when we see it when it comes to what makes a good scientific theory. We're looking for something that is a simple, coherent theory that explains the largest amount of data. And when it comes to that, it's not hard to imagine aspects of the observed world that you might say the best possible explanation for this observed phenomenon is the existence of God. Historically, that has certainly been true. So motion is one of them. Remember, one of Aristotle's conceptions of God is an unmoved mover. And this is the one, when I was an undergraduate at my Catholic university taking all those religion courses, made the least sense to me. And it took me years later until I finally figured out why it made no sense to me, why you needed to have an explanation for why things are moving. And the answer was that in an Aristotelian metaphysics, you're basing what happens on an Aristotelian physics, in which motion is something that needs to be explained, right? In Aristotelian physics, in order to get something moving, you have to push on it and keep pushing on it. And we see things moving all over the place, so there must be something doing some ultimate pushing in some sense. But then along comes what we now know as conservation of momentum. Avicenna and Newton and Galileo point out that left to their own devices, things do not need to be pushed constantly to keep moving. Things will just keep moving.